Thanksgiving wasn't supposed to be like this. It never is, I suppose, but that doesn't make it any easier. As I stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the fading autumn sky, I couldn't help but think of all the quiet, peaceful holidays we had before Charlie's life turned upside down. Back then, the house felt warm, alive. Now, it was cold. Not just from the boarded-up windows that Eva and I had put up a few months ago, but from something deeper, a hollow feeling that settled in after years of Charlie's chaos. Eva was pacing around the living room, his hands clenched into fists. He always got like this when it came to Charlie. "I'm telling you, this is a mistake," he muttered for what had to be the third time that day. I didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch. Maybe he was right. Maybe inviting Charlie back for Thanksgiving was asking for trouble. But then again, what were we supposed to do? He was our brother, after all, and it felt like leaving him out in the cold was somehow even worse. "You think I don't know that?" I finally replied, rubbing my temples. The kitchen smelled of turkey and gravy, the kind of scent that should have made me feel comforted. Instead, it made me nauseous. But what else can we do? It's Thanksgiving. We owe him that much. Even stopped pacing and shot me a look that could burn a hole through a wall. Owe him? After everything he's put us through, you think we still owe him something? I didn't have a good answer for that. It had been years of the same routine. Charlie would show up in our lives, dragging behind him a mess of addiction, debt, and empty promises, only to disappear just as quickly, leaving us to clean up after him. Each time he swore he'd change, and each time he fell deeper into whatever hole he was digging for himself. But something inside me couldn't shake the guilt. It wasn't just that Charlie was family. It was that we'd all been through so much already. First, Mom and Dad, gone in a car crash when we were still kids, and then losing our grandparents, the ones who raised us. This house was all we had left. I turned away from the window, glancing around the room. It didn't look like the home we grew up in anymore. The boarded-up windows made sure of that. After the last break-in, a few months back, when we thought Charlie might have been involved, we couldn't take any chances. The windows and doors were sealed tight, making the house feel less like a home and more like a fortress. We were keeping something out, or maybe we were the ones trapped inside. "Look," I said, "we'll invite him for dinner, and if things go south, we can tell him to leave. But we have to try, even. We owe him that much. One more chance." Even sighed, running his hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, worn down by years of playing the responsible one, the one who always cleaned up the messes. "Fine," he said, "but I'm not pretending like everything's okay." We both knew what he meant. Thanksgiving was just another day, and Charlie coming over didn't mean things would magically be different. It was more of the same year after year. But we had to hold on to something, even if that something was just the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, Charlie would be different this time. When the doorbell rang later that evening, my stomach dropped. Eva gave me a look, but neither of us moved for a second. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the faint sound of wind rattling against the boards on the windows. I swallowed hard and went to open the door. There he was. Charlie stood on the porch, his shoulders slumped, his hair greasy and unkempt. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his eyes, those same eyes I'd seen my whole life, looked haunted, distant. I could tell right away that he wasn't sober, not tonight, maybe not ever. "Hey, little brother," Charlie slurred, his smile half-hearted, more of a grimace. "Got room for one more?" I wanted to slam the door in his face. I wanted to tell him to get lost, to go back to whatever hellhole he'd crawled out of. But I couldn't. Instead, I stepped aside, letting him into the house, the weight of his presence sinking into every corner of the room. Eva stood in the doorway to the living room, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Dinner's ready," I muttered, not sure what else to say. Charlie didn't seem to notice the tension. He wandered into the dining room, staring at the spread of food like it was some alien sight. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he fidgeted, picking at his sleeves and glancing around the room like he was waiting for something to happen. I couldn't tell if he was nervous or just too far gone to focus. We sat down to eat, but the silence was unbearable. Even, and I barely touched our food, our eyes occasionally drifting to Charlie, who just pushed the turkey around his plate. After a few awkward minutes, he stood up suddenly, mumbling something about needing to grab something from his car. "Charlie," I started, "you don't have a car." He paused at the door, turning back to give me a blank stare, as if he hadn't heard me. Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. Even and I exchanged a look. Neither of us moved. The house felt colder than ever, and outside, the wind howled. We sat there in silence, waiting for something to happen. The silence in the house felt like a weight pressing down on us, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Charlie had been gone for what seemed like an eternity. Ethan kept glancing at the clock, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could hear his teeth grinding. I couldn't blame him. Every time Charlie left, there was always this dread, this gnawing feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. This time felt no different, maybe worse. "I'm telling you, this doesn't feel right," Ethan muttered under his breath, his eyes locked on the half-open front door. The cold wind from outside seemed to creep into the house, making the already tense atmosphere feel even more unsettling. "He's up to something." I wanted to tell him to relax, but I couldn't shake the same feeling. Something about the way Charlie had looked, so distant, so out of it, made my skin crawl. He barely said a word during dinner, and now he was just gone. But where? He didn't have a car. We both knew that. He hadn't even mentioned borrowing one. The whole thing felt off. "I'll check outside," I said, standing up from the table, though every instinct told me I didn't want to know what was going on. I stepped onto the porch, the wind biting at my face. The darkness beyond the front yard was thick, the kind that swallowed up everything, and made it hard to see past the edge of the driveway. And that's when I noticed it, the black van. It had been parked there all day, just sitting quietly across the street, like it belonged to one of the neighbors. I hadn't thought much of it earlier. Why would I? It wasn't uncommon to see cars parked along the street. But now, with Charlie missing, and that van sitting there, unmoving, something about it made my stomach twist. Its windows were so dark, I couldn't see inside. No lights, no movement, just an ominous presence watching over the house like it was waiting for something. I stepped back inside, shutting the door firmly behind me, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. "There's a van parked outside," I told Ethan. "It's been there all day." Ethan frowned, his face hardening. "And you think that's a coincidence?" "I don't know," I admitted, rubbing my hands together to warm them. "But I don't like it." Before Ethan could say anything, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I grabbed it, my heart sinking when I saw the caller ID. It was Charlie. I hesitated for a moment before answering, bracing myself for whatever excuse or half-baked story he was about to give. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Charlie's voice on the other end was shaky, barely audible over the wind. "I'm at the reservoir," he said, his words slurring together, like he was struggling to keep it together. I need help. I think I messed up. I'm hurt." The reservoir. My mind raced. The reservoir was behind the house, a place we played as kids, but it wasn't somewhere you went at night. Not alone, anyway. The area was dense with trees, the water deep and dark, reflecting the moonlight like a black mirror. The idea of Charlie wandering around there, in the state he was in, made my blood run cold. "What do you mean you're hurt?" I asked, trying to get more out of him, but the line crackled, and I could barely hear him. "You need to come now," he whispered. "Please." Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a moment, the dread building inside me. This felt wrong. So wrong. Charlie wasn't one to ask for help, not unless he was really desperate. And what was he doing at the reservoir in the first place? Even was watching me, his arms crossed, waiting for me to fill him in. Charlie says, "He's at the reservoir," I said, my voice hollow. He said he's hurt. Evan's face twisted into a mixture of frustration and disbelief. And you believe him. He's probably setting us up for something, and you know it. This is exactly what he does. He pulls us into his mess, and we just follow along like idiots. I wanted to argue, but Evan wasn't wrong. Charlie had done this before, played the victim, dragged us out to help him, only for us to find out he'd been lying or using us for some bigger scheme. But this time, something about the way he sounded, the fear in his voice, felt real. And despite everything, he was still our brother. "I'm going," I said firmly. "I can't just leave him there." Evan cursed under his breath, pacing again, his fists clenched. After a long pause, he sighed, throwing his jacket on. "Fine. But if this is another one of his games, I'm done. You hear me? I'm not doing this anymore." I nodded, though part of me wondered if this would be the last time we ever did this. Together, we grabbed flashlights and headed out the back door, the wind whipping through the trees as we made our way toward the reservoir. The night felt unnaturally still, the darkness pressing in around us as we navigated the narrow path through the woods. By the time we reached the water, the moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the surface of the reservoir. It looked so different from the place we played as kids, a place of adventure and freedom. Now it felt cold, sinister, as if the water itself was hiding something beneath its smooth surface. We called out for Charlie, our voices echoing through the trees. But there was no response, just the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant sound of the wind. My heart pounded in my chest, fear and frustration mixing together. Where was he? For what felt like an eternity, we searched, scanning the shoreline and calling his name. But Charlie was nowhere to be found. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. "This is insane," Evan muttered, his flashlight beam dancing across the water. "He's not here." I didn't know what to think. Had Charlie lied? Had he dragged us out here just to mess with us again? Or was something else going on, something we couldn't understand? The van, the call, the eerie stillness of the reservoir. It all felt wrong, like we were caught in some twisted game we didn't know the rules to. "We should go back," I said quietly, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I didn't want to admit it, but Evan was right. Something wasn't adding up. Charlie wasn't here, and I had no idea where he'd gone. As we turned to leave, a strange sense of foreboding settled over me. The darkness around us seemed to close in, the trees swaying like silent watchers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had brought us out here wasn't over. Not yet. The walk back from the reservoir felt longer than it should have. Neither Evan nor I said much as we trudged through the woods, our flashlights flickering in the dark. My mind kept circling back to Charlie's voice on the phone. The desperation, the fear. But now it felt like a cruel joke. He wasn't there, and we'd been left standing on the shore like fools, shouting his name into the night. Evan's face was hard, his jaw clenched in that way he does when he's trying to keep his anger in check. I could tell he was furious, not just with Charlie, but with me too, for dragging him into this again. Part of me wanted to apologize, to tell him he was right all along. But another part of me was too angry at Charlie to even find the words. How could he do this to us? Again. As we got closer to the house, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. Something was off. The porch light was flickering, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. And the front door, which we had left slightly ajar when we went after Charlie, was now wide open. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. Evan noticed too, his flashlight beam hovering over the darkened doorway. "Did you leave the door open like that?" Evan asked, his voice tight. I shook my head, my throat dry. "No, I thought it was just cracked." not wide open like that. We exchanged a look, and I could see the same fear and suspicion in his eyes. Something was wrong. I stepped onto the porch, pushing the door open the rest of the way. The house was dark, the only light coming from our flashlights as we stepped inside. And that's when I saw it. The house was completely torn apart. The living room was in shambles, furniture overturned, drawers yanked out, and their contents strewn across the floor. The family photos that had once lined the mantel were smashed, their frames shattered into jagged pieces. Our grandparents' heirlooms, things we'd held onto after their passing, lay scattered and broken. It was as if a tornado had torn through the place. What the hell? Evan's voice was barely a whisper as he stepped into the room, his eyes wide with shock. I felt a cold, hollow emptiness open up inside me as I took it all in. This wasn't just a break-in. This was personal. Someone had gone through everything, every corner of the house, ripping it apart. The dining room, where we'd awkwardly tried to have Thanksgiving dinner just hours before, was no better. The table was overturned, the turkey and sides now a disgusting mess on the floor, mixed with shattered plates and broken glass. Charlie, I muttered, the name coming out like a curse. Evan's head snapped toward me, his face twisted with anger. You think Charlie did this? Who else could it be? I shot back, my voice rising in frustration. He disappears, we go looking for him. And then this happens. He must have known we'd leave the house empty. This was a setup. Evan's hands clenched into fists. I knew it. I knew this was a mistake. I told you, didn't I? But no, we had to give him another chance. His words stung, but I couldn't argue with him. This whole thing reeked of Charlie's manipulation, the same pattern we'd been dealing with for years. He always found a way to get what he wanted, even if it meant burning every bridge between us. I moved through the house, stepping over the wreckage, my heart pounding in my chest. The more I looked around, the worse it got. Every room was trashed. The bedrooms had been rifled through, clothes pulled from drawers, the sheets ripped off the beds. In my room, the little box I kept hidden under my bed, the one with old letters from Mom and Dad, and some photos of us as kids, was gone, completely gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space under my bed, feeling like a piece of me had been ripped away. It wasn't about the things that were stolen. It was about the violation, the destruction of the few things that still connected us to our family, to the life we'd had before Charlie had dragged us into his world of chaos. This is it, Evan said from behind me, his voice hard and cold. I'm done. We can't keep doing this. He's never going to change. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. Evan was right. Charlie wasn't going to change. He was always going to be the same, dragging us down with him, pulling us into his mess, and then disappearing when things got too hard. But even knowing that, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at my gut. What do we do now? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Evan sighed, running a hand through his hair. We call the police. We file a report. And then we cut him off. For good. I wanted to argue, to tell Evan that we couldn't just walk away from Charlie, no matter how bad things had gotten. But looking around at the destruction, the mess he'd left behind, I didn't have the energy. Maybe Evan was right. Maybe it was time to let Charlie go, to stop trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. As we made our way back to the living room, I noticed something strange. The van, the one that had been parked outside earlier, was gone. I glanced through the shattered front window. The night still and quiet, as if the world outside had moved on while we were stuck in this nightmare. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been in that van, they were part of this. Maybe they'd been watching the house, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Maybe Charlie was involved, or maybe he was just a pawn in something bigger, something we couldn't see. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. Nothing was going to be the same after this. The house was wrecked, our lives were upended, and the thin thread that had held our family together was fraying fast. As much as I wanted to believe we could fix it, that somehow we could get back to how things used to be, deep down, I knew the truth. We were too far gone. Charlie had taken everything, our trust, our hope, and now, the only place we'd ever called home. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Even. We both sat in silence, watching the shadows dance across the walls of the ransacked living room. The place was in ruins, and so were we. I could feel it, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Years of trying to hold on to something that was long gone. Charlie had destroyed everything, and this time it felt permanent. The air in the house was thick with tension, and every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. At some point, Even stood up, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I could see it in his eyes. He was done. There was nothing left to salvage. But for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. I didn't know why, but I felt like something was still coming. Something worse. "Let's just get through the night," I mumbled, barely able to keep my voice steady. "In the morning, we'll call the cops. We'll figure it out." Even didn't respond. He just kept pacing, shaking his head in disbelief. I couldn't blame him. How many times had we said we'd figure it out when it came to Charlie? And every time, we ended up right back where we started, or worse off. Now, with the house destroyed and everything we owned gone, it felt like Charlie had finally succeeded in pulling us down to his level. It was sometime around 2 in the morning when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming against glass. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping against one of the boarded-up windows. But the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I froze, staring toward the front of the house. Even noticed it too, stopping mid-step, his eyes narrowing. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone, or something, was trying to get in. I reached for the flashlight on the table, my hand trembling as I clicked it on, and aimed the beam toward the source of the noise. It was coming from the second-story window, the one in our grandparents' old bedroom. And there, outside the window, was Charlie. He was standing there, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and empty. His clothes were filthy, torn, and soaked, as if he'd been out in the rain for hours. But it hadn't rained that night. He looked wrong, like a shadow of himself, like something that wasn't supposed to be there. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Charlie," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Even stood next to me, his face twisted in confusion and fear. "What the hell is he doing up there?" I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, my mind racing. How had he gotten up there? The boards on the window were still intact, and the front door was locked. And then there was the look on his face, vacant, like he wasn't really seeing us, like he was already gone. Without thinking, I started toward the stairs. I don't know what I was hoping to accomplish. Maybe I thought I could talk to him, get him down, figure out what was going on. But as soon as I reached the landing, the tapping stopped. I hesitated, listening to the sudden silence that filled the house. The air felt heavy, thick with dread. "Charlie," I called out, my voice echoing through the hallway. No answer, just the eerie, empty quiet. I stepped closer to the window, my flashlight beam trembling as I aimed it toward where Charlie had been. But when the light hit the glass, there was nothing there. He was gone. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I turned back to Even, who was still standing at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "He's gone," I whispered. "He was right there, and now he's gone." Even didn't say anything. He just stood there, frozen, like he didn't know what to believe. And maybe he didn't. I wasn't even sure I believed what I'd seen. But before I could say anything else, a new sound cut through the silence. A low, crackling noise, like the sound of fire. I rushed to the window, throwing it open. The smell hit me first. thick, acrid smoke pouring into the room. And then I saw it. Flames licking up the side of the house, glowing orange and red in the darkness. The fire was spreading fast, already consuming the lower level, crawling up toward the second story. I screamed, racing back down the stairs. The house is on fire. He didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed what little we could. My phone, the flashlight, nothing else. There was no time. The fire had already taken over the living room, the flames dancing across the ruined furniture, the shattered frames, and broken heirlooms. It was all burning, everything we had left of our family, going up in smoke. We barely made it out the front door before the flames engulfed the house entirely. The heat was intense, the air thick with smoke. We stood in the front yard, watching helplessly as the fire consumed everything. The house, the one place that had tied us to our past, to our family, was gone. And so was Charlie. I stared at the flames, my mind numb. Was this Charlie's doing? Had he set the fire, knowing we'd be trapped inside? Or was this something else, something darker? I couldn't shake the image of him standing outside the window, his empty eyes staring at me like he wasn't really there. Even stood next to me, his face a mask of anger and sorrow. "This is it," he said quietly. "It's all gone." I didn't answer. What could I say? He was right. Everything was gone. The house, the memories, even the slim hope that we could ever save Charlie. All of it had gone up in flames. And as we stood there, watching the fire devour what was left of our lives, I couldn't help but feel like the fire had taken more than just the house. It had taken whatever fragile bond we had left with Charlie. And in that moment, I knew, deep down, that we weren't just watching a house burn. We were watching the last pieces of our family disappear into the night.